Joining us from his home in Massachusetts is MIT professor Noam Chomsky, author of numerous books and in particular focusing on the topic that we're going to address, Fateful Triangle, the culture of terrorism, and pirates and emperors, international terrorism in the real world. Good morning, Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, I'm here.
As you know, there's rage, anger, and bewilderment in the United States since the September 11th events. There have been murders, attacks on mosques, and even a Sikh temple. The University of Colorado, which is located here in Boulder, a town which has a liberal reputation, has graffiti saying, "Go home Arabs, bomb Afghanistan, and go home sand niggers." What's your perspective on what has evolved since the terrorist attacks?
Well, it's mixed. I mean, what you're describing certainly exists. On the other hand, countercurrents exist. For example, I know they do where I've been and where I have contacts, but in this morning's New York Times, there's a report on the mood in New York, including places where the memorials are for the victims of the terrorist attack. And it points out that peace signs and calls for restraint vastly outnumber calls for retaliation, and that the mood of the people they could see was very mixed and, in fact, generally opposed to violent action. That's another current. And also supportive of people who are being targeted here because they look dark or have a funny name or something like that. So sure, there are countercurrents, and the question is, what can we do to make the right ones prevail?
The media have been noticeably lacking in providing context and a background for the attacks on New York and Washington. What might be some useful information that you could provide?
Well, there are two categories of information that are particularly useful because there are actually two sources for the attack. Let's assume that, as I presume is correct, that the attack is rooted somehow in the bin Laden network. That sounds plausible, at least. So let's say it's right. If that's right, there are two categories of information and of populations that we should be concerned with. They're linked, but they're not identical. One is the bin Laden network. That's a category by themselves. Another is the population of the region. And they're not the same thing, though there are links. And what ought to be right in the forefront is discussion of both of those. Now, the bin Laden network, I doubt if anybody knows it better than the CIA, since they were instrumental in helping construct it. This is a network of which the development started actually in 1979. If we can believe President Carter's national security advisor, speaking of Brzezinski, he's claimed, maybe he's just bragging or something, but he claimed at least that back in mid-1979 he had instigated secret support for mujahideen fighting against the government of Afghanistan in an effort to draw the Russians into what he called an Afghan trap, phrase worth remembering. Draw them into an Afghan trap, and he's very proud of the fact that they did fall into the Afghan trap, sending military forces to support the government 6 months later or so, and then with the consequences that we know. Well, the U.S. right away, not alone, along with Egypt, French intelligence was right in the center of it, Saudi Arabian funding, Israel was involved. They assembled a major army, a huge mercenary army, I think maybe 50,000 people or so, and they drew from the most militant sectors they could find, which happened to be radical Islamists, what are called here Islamic fundamentalists, from all over, most of them not from Afghanistan. They're called Afghanis, but like bin Laden, they come from elsewhere. Bin Laden got there pretty quickly. He was involved in the funding networks, which probably are the ones that still exist. They were trained, armed, organized by CIA, French intelligence, Egypt, and others to fight a holy war against the Russians. And they did. They fought a holy war against the Russians. They carried terror into Russian territory. They may have delayed the Russian withdrawal, as a number of analysts believe, but it certainly went on, and finally the Russians, for their own reasons, withdrew. They didn't stop. In fact, right through this period, they didn't stop. In fact, in 1981, groups based in that same network assassinated President Sadat of Egypt, who had been instrumental in setting it up. In 1983, one suicide bomber essentially drove the U.S. military out of Lebanon. And it continued by 1989, when they were succeeded in their holy war in Afghanistan. They told us very frankly what they're going to do. As soon as the U.S. established what amounts to a permanent military presence in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden and the rest announced that that, from their point of view, was comparable to the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. They were going to turn the guns on the Americans, as they had already done in 1983 when they had military forces in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia is a major enemy, just as Egypt is. That's what they want to overthrow, what they call the un-Islamic governments of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, other states of the Middle East and North Africa. And it continues. So in 1997, they murdered roughly 60 tourists in Egypt and practically destroyed the Egyptian tourist industry. And they've been carrying out activities all over the region, North Africa, East Africa, Middle East, for years. That's one group. And that is kind of an outgrowth of the U.S. Wars of, I believe, Brzezinski, even before, when they set the Afghan trap, as he calls it. Well, that's one group, and there's a lot more to say about them, but that's one part. Another is the people of the region. Now, they're connected, of course, and the bin Laden network and others like them, the Afghanis, they draw a lot of their support from the desperation and anger and resentment of people of the region, which is from rich to poor. The Wall Street Journal, to its credit, has run a couple of articles on attitudes of wealthy Muslims, as they call it, the kind of people who would most interest them, businessmen, bankers, professionals, and others throughout the Middle East region, who are very frank about expressing their grievances. They put it more politely than the poor people in the slums and in the streets. But it's clear, and everybody knows what they are. For one thing, they're very angry about the U.S. support for undemocratic, repressive regimes in the region, and U.S. insistence on blocking any efforts towards democratic opening. You just heard on the news, it sounded like BBC, a report that the Algerian government is now all interested in getting involved in this war. The announcer there said that there had been plenty of Islamic terrorism in Algeria, which is true, but he didn't say the other side, that a lot of the terrorism is apparently state terrorism. In fact, there's pretty strong evidence for that. The government, of course, is interested in repressing. In fact, that government is one that is in office because it blocked a democratic election in which it lost to mainly Islamic-based groups, and that set off the current fighting. Well, that's happening throughout the region. So that's one array of they also complain, the businessmen and bankers and so on, that the U.S. has blocked independent economic development by propping up oppressive regimes, is the phrase they use. But the prime concern, stressed in the Wall Street Journal articles and by everybody who knows anything about the region or even cares, the prime concern from the wealthy Muslims, who are pro-American, incidentally, is the dual U.S. policies, which contrast very sharply in their eyes and correctly, the dual policies towards Iraq and Israel. In the case of Iraq, for the last 10 years, the U.S. and Britain have been devastating the civilian society. I mean, Madeleine Albright's famous statement about how, yes, maybe 500,000 children have died, and it's a high price, but we're willing to pay it. That doesn't sound too good among people who care that maybe it matters if 500,000 children are killed by the United States and Britain. On the one, and meanwhile, they're strengthening Saddam Hussein, as they know. So that's one side. On the other side, the same United States is the prime support and the basis for support for the Israeli military occupation of Palestinian territory. It's now in its 35th year. It's been harsh and brutal from the beginning, extremely repressive. Most of this hasn't been discussed here, and the U.S. role has been virtually suppressed here. It goes back 25 years of blocking diplomatic initiatives. I mean, even the simple fact that the United States, that after the fight, I'm going to just take one fact right now. I mean, as soon as the current conflict began last September 30th, Israel immediately, the next day, began using helicopters, meaning U.S. helicopters, because they can't make helicopters, to attack civilian targets. The next couple of days, they killed several dozen people attacking apartment complexes and others. On October 3rd, incidentally, the fighting was all in the occupied territories, and there was no fire. You know, the Palestinians were not using any fire; they were throwing stones. So this is people throwing stones against occupiers in a military occupation. You know, it's legitimate resistance by world standards. On October 3rd, Clinton made the biggest deal in a decade to send new military helicopters to Israel, and that then continued the next couple of months. And that wasn't even reported. Still hasn't been reported, as far as I'm aware. But they know it. You know, they look in the sky and they see attack helicopters coming. They know fairly well they're U.S. attack helicopters sent for that purpose. When a couple of weeks later they started using them for assassinations, the U.S. issued some reprimands but sent more. Meanwhile, the settlement policies, which have taken over substantial parts of the territories and made it virtually, and are designed to make it virtually impossible for a viable independent state to develop, they're supported by the United States. U.S. provides the funding, the diplomatic support. This is the only country that's blocked the overwhelming international consensus on condemning this under the Geneva Conventions. That's in fact everybody outside the United States. Well, they know that, you know, and this is really has been all along and is getting worse. Extremely harsh military occupation.
Professor Chomsky, let me just interject. If I could sum up the 3 points that I think you're making, and then see if there's anything else you want to add to those. It seems that the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia is a prime motivator for some of the people that are alleged to be behind these attacks. 2, the ongoing U.S.-UK bombing of Iraq and the 10 years of sanctions against that country. And 3, the massive U.S. support for Israeli military occupation of Palestinians. Is there anything else?
Yeah, there's a lot more. 4 is the fact that the supported oppressive, authoritarian, harsh regimes, blocked democratic initiatives, and
such as?
What, such as?
Yeah.
Well, for example, the one I mentioned in Algeria, or right now in Turkey, or in Egypt, or throughout the Arabian Peninsula. You know, every harsh, brutal, oppressive regime is backed by the United States. In fact, that's true of Saddam Hussein. You know, look, let's take a striking example. In March 1991, right after the Gulf War, he was in total command of the air and everything else. There was a rebellion in the southern part of Iraq, organized with rebelling Iraqi generals, in fact. They could have overthrown Saddam Hussein, probably. They didn't ask for U.S. support. They just asked for access to captured Iraqi arms, which the U.S. refused. The U.S. tacitly authorized Saddam Hussein to use air power to crush it. And the reasons were stated. Thomas Friedman, who was then the diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, put it clearly and approvingly. He said the U.S. preferred an iron-fisted military dictatorship in Iraq in the interest of what's called stability, preferred that to rebellion, with popular rebellion, which would overthrow it. I mean, you can't, maybe people here don't want to look, but I mean, that was all over the front page of the newspapers, and they know it. And that's just one example. It's true throughout the region. That's why pro-American bankers and businessmen and others are condemning the United States for supporting anti-democratic regimes and stopping economic development.
Professor Chomsky, talk about the relationship between ends and means. Let's say you have a noble goal. You want to bring perpetrators of horrendous terrorist crimes to justice. What about the ends to reach those means?
Well, I mean, suppose you want to bring presidents of the United States to justice. Well, if they're guilty of horrendous terrorist acts, there's a way to do it. In fact, there are even precedents. For example, Nicaragua in the 1980s was subjected to a violent assault by the United States. Killed tens of thousands of people, died. The country was practically destroyed, may not even recover. Much worse even than the tragedies in New York the other day, the atrocities there. They didn't set off bombs in Washington. They went to the World Court, which issued a judgment in their favor, condemning the United States for what it called unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism, ordering the U.S. to desist and pay substantial reparations. The U.S., of course, dismissed the court judgment with contempt. So Nicaragua then went to the Security Council, which they're supposed to do. The Security Council passed a resolution calling on states to observe international law, meaning the United States. The U.S. vetoed it. So they went to the General Assembly, where they got a similar resolution and passed near unanimously. U.S. and Israel opposed. That's the way you proceed. If Nicaragua had been powerful enough, could have set up another criminal court. Well, those are the measures the U.S. could pursue, and nobody's going to block it. And that's what they're being asked to do by people throughout the region, including their allies. I mean, for example, President Mubarak of Egypt, remember the governments in the Middle East and North Africa, like this terrorist Algerian government, was one of the most vicious of all. They would be happy to join the United States in opposing terrorist networks which are attacking them. Remember, they're the prime target. The United States is in the background. So sure, they'd be happy to join it, but they want some evidence. And they want to do it in a framework of at least minimal commitment to international law. So Egypt, which is right in the Egyptian position is really strange. I mean, they are part of the primary system that organized the Bin Laden network. They were the first victims of it when Sadat was assassinated. They've been major victims of it since. They'd like to crush it, but as they say, after some evidence is presented about who's involved, and within the framework of the UN Charter, that is, under the Security Council aegis. That's a way to proceed.
So, I mean, do you think then it's more than problematic to engage in alliances with whom are called unsavory characters, drug traffickers and assassins, in order to achieve what is said to be a noble end?
Remember that the most unsavory characters, the governments of the region and our own and its allies, if we are serious about it. So I think I would rather we have to ask, what were the noble ends? Was it a noble end to draw the Russians into an Afghan trap, for example, in 1979, as Brzezinski claims he did? Supporting a resistance against the Russian invasion, yeah, that's one thing. But organizing a terrorist army of Islamic fanatics for your own purposes, that's a different thing. The question we should be asking now is, what about the alliance that's being formed that the U.S. is trying to put together? And recall, we should not forget that the United States itself is a leading terrorist state. What about the alliance between the United States, Russia, China, Indonesia, Egypt, Algeria, all of whom are delighted to see an international system developed, sponsored by the United States, which will authorize them to carry out their own terrorist atrocities. I mean, Russia, for example, would be very happy to have U.S. backing for its war in Chechnya. In Chechnya, you have the same Afghanis fighting against the Russians.
As perhaps would India.
Yeah, India would. Indonesia would be delighted to massacre in Aceh. Algeria, as just announced, would be delighted to have authorization to extend its own state terrorism.
Yeah.
And that runs through the world.
Now, I think your comment that the U.S. is a leading terrorist state might stun many Americans. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I just gave one example. The United States is, in fact, the only country that was condemned for international terrorism by the World Court, and that rejected a Security Council resolution calling on states to observe international law so that it could continue its international terrorism. And that's the least of it. I mean, the big one, everybody here was quite properly outraged by the Oklahoma City bombing. And for a couple of days, the headlines all read, Oklahoma City looks like Beirut, let's go after the Arabs. I didn't see anybody point out that Beirut also looks like Beirut. And part of the reason is because the Reagan administration set off a terrorist bombing there in 1985 that was very much like Oklahoma City. Truck bombing outside a mosque, timed to kill the maximum number of people as they left, did kill 80 or so, wounded 200. Aimed at a Muslim cleric they didn't like and who they missed. And it was not very secret. Yeah, it's a terrorist act. Or take one, or I don't know what name you give to the attack that's killed maybe 1 million civilians in Iraq and 500,000 children, which Secretary of State says is a price we're willing to pay. Is there a name for that? I don't know exactly what the name is. Supporting Israeli atrocities is another one. Supporting Turkey's crushing of its own Kurdish population, for which the Clinton administration gave the decisive support, 80% of the arms, escalating as atrocities increased, is another.
What about the
bombing of the Sudan?
I was just going to ask you about the 1998 missile attacks on
one little footnote
Sudan and
so
Afghanistan.
Small that nobody even mentions it. How blew up half the pharmaceutical supplies in the United States? And that's not a fair analogy because that's a poor country which can't replenish them. I mean, nobody knows how many tens of thousands of people's of deaths followed from that. Well, if somebody had in the United States, we'd notice it. In fact, we'd probably call for nuking them. But in this case, we say, oh, well, too bad. Let's go on to the next topic. Well, other people in the world don't react like that.
In your book, Culture of Terrorism, you write that the cultural scene is illuminated with particular clarity by the thinking of the liberal doves who set the limits for respectable dissent. How have they been performing since the events of September 11th?
Let's since I don't like to generalize, let's take a concrete example. On September 16th, the New York Times published the statement that the United States has demanded that Pakistan cut off food aid to Afghanistan. That had already been hinted at a couple of days before, but here it was stated flat out. The food aid that is keeping, probably millions of people just barely on this side of starvation. Now, I presume that if the United States gives the orders, Pakistan implements them. What does that mean? That means that unknown numbers of people, maybe millions, of starving Afghans will die. Are these Taliban? No, they're victims of the Taliban. Many of them are internal refugees kept from leaving. But here's a statement saying, okay, let's proceed to kill unknown numbers, maybe millions of starving Afghans who are victims of the Taliban. What was the reaction? Well, actually, I was spent almost the entire day afterwards on radio and television around the world, and I kept bringing it up, and nobody in Europe or the United States could find one word of reaction. Elsewhere in the world, there was plenty of reaction. I mean, even around the periphery of Europe, like Greece. But how do you react to this? I mean, suppose that some power was strong enough to say, okay, let's do something that will cause, say, 1 million Americans to die of starvation. Would we think it's a serious problem?
National Public Radio, which in the 1980s was denounced by the Reagan administration as Radio Managua on the Potomac, is considered kind of also out there on the liberal end of respectable debate. Noah Adams, the host of All Things Considered, asked these questions just on September 17th. Should assassinations be allowed, and should the CIA be given more operating leeway? Could you comment on those?
You know, the CIA should not be permitted to carry out assassinations, but that's the least of it. I mean, should the CIA be permitted to carry out a car bombing and to organize a car bombing in Beirut of the kind that I described? I mean, that didn't violate any laws. Should they have been authorized to, it's not just the CIA, to organize in Nicaragua a terrorist army which had the official task, right, straight out of the mouth of the State Department, to attack soft targets, meaning undefended agricultural cooperatives and health clinics. I mean, what's the name for that? Should the government have, or to set up something like the Bin Laden network, and not him himself, but the background network for it? You know, it's just the wrong question. Sure, they shouldn't. I mean, should the United States be authorized to provide Israel with attack helicopters to carry out political assassinations? No, that's not the CIA. That's the Clinton administration.
One final question, Professor Chomsky. We're running out of time. Could you very briefly define the political uses of terrorism, and where does it fit in the doctrinal system?
The United States is officially committed to what is called low-intensity warfare. That's the official doctrine. If you read the definition of low-intensity warfare in, say, Army manuals, and you compare it with, say, the U.S. Code, the definition of terrorism, you find they're almost the same. Terrorism is the use of coercive means aimed at civilian populations in an effort to achieve a political, religious, or other aim. That's terrorism. That's what the World Trade Center bombing was. And that's official doctrine. We use it all the time. You know? I mean, I mentioned a couple of examples. We can go on and on. It's simply part of state action. Furthermore, all of these things should be well known. It's shameful that they're not. Anybody who wants to find out about them can, for example, read an excellent collection of essays published 10 years ago by a major publisher in England, here too, called Western State Terrorism, which just runs through lots and lots of cases. Yeah, that's the kind of thing people should know if they want to understand anything about themselves.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time, Professor Chomsky. Thanks so much for joining us.
Okay.
We've been talking to Noam Chomsky, internationally renowned MIT professor, author of Fateful Triangle, The Culture of Terrorism, and Pirates and Emperors, International Terrorism in the Real World. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.